Back in late 2010, Chevrolet launched the Volt range-extended electric car, a direct competitor to the newly launched Nissan Leaf, if only because they were the only two plug-in cars you could buy at the time from a major automaker. It offered around 35 miles of range per charge on the US EPA test cycle from its 16 kilowatt-hour battery pack. That is before its 1.4-litre EcoFlex engine kicked in to operate as a range extender. At its launch, it was sold in North America only, but then sales were expanded to Europe, New Zealand and Australia. In New Zealand and Australia, it was sold for a limited time as the Holden Volt. In Europe, it was sold as both the Chevrolet Volt and the Opel or Vauxhall Ampera. I know, I owned one of the only 125 right-hand drive Volts ever sold in the UK, and fully charged Johnny Smith owns one of the others. Outside of these countries they were available, but even in smaller numbers. And outside of the US, sales were never all that great, and eventually, thanks to higher sticker prices, a styling that didn't really fit in with local markets, and a lack of interest from dealers, export sales were all but done by 2015. Unlike most plug-in hybrids, where the gasoline engine kicked in if you pushed the pedal too hard or too briskly, even if there was enough charge in the battery pack, the Volt could generally be driven like a purely electric vehicle, as long as you kept the battery pack charged. And with a range that went from 35 miles per charge to 38 miles per charge over the course of the first generation lifespan, thanks to improved battery packs year on year, and then a range of 53 miles per charge when the second generation model launched in 2016, it was a car that many people really did only drive in electric mode for the majority of the time. But then suddenly, not so long ago, GM announced that the Volt would cease production as part of its goal to make a shift towards fully electric and fully autonomous vehicles. It was a surprise announcement, especially as the second generation Volt has only been on sale for a few years. But the model's culling was part of a massive lineup slash at GM, which saw many of its cars cancelled in favour of more SUVs and pickups. The Chevrolet Bolt EV, the Volt's all-electric, long-range compact hatch sibling, did survive the cull. Today, at the time of filming this, there are still examples of brand new 2019 Chevrolet Volts, however, sitting on dealer lots in part of the US. But for the most part, it's not a car that you can buy anymore. So what really killed the Volt? Some hardened electric car fans will say it was GM being GM, that it never wanted the Volt to succeed and that it was like the EV1 all over again, and that the Bolt faces a similar fate in the not-too-distant future. I can see how that opinion has been cultivated, but I think it's more subtle than that. Some have suggested it's because the Volt was too complicated for customers to understand. And again, I can understand that logic. But GM has suggested it was because the Volt was part of a large portfolio of hatchbacks and sedans that had suffered dwindling sales in recent years and wasn't making the company a lot of money. And it wanted to save money in order to bring new electric vehicles to market. And to some extent that may have played a part. I mean, unlike 2011 when oil prices were more than $110 a barrel and people were really feeling the pain of filling up large gas guzzlers, the price of oil tanked to below $30 a barrel in 2016, and while it has been rising since, is still just over half of what it was in 2011. So with oil so cheap and therefore gasoline so cheap, customers were less worried about the cost to fill up large SUVs and pickup trucks, and so more were sold, which meant that GM saw a lowering in demand. But I don't think it's possible to use this excuse on its own. You see, customer sales figures were in part not caused by a lack of interest by customers, but a lack of interest by dealerships. Dealerships not only get to make money from cars they sell, but from cars they maintain. Aftermarket sales and service is big business for dealership, but because plug-in cars generally require less servicing, and because dealerships had to go through specialist training to get their staff ready to work on plug-in cars, many dealerships just opted not to bother. But it wasn't down to the individual salespeople, because they're working on a commission. A car sale is a car sale. They don't care what happens afterwards. Dealers at dealerships who did sell the Volt found out that they couldn't make as much profit on a Volt as they could on another car on the lot. So it became common for dealerships to try and steer customers away from the Volt and towards other vehicles, even if those customers had entered the dealership wanting a Volt. But that was less to do with service and more to do with a lack of knowledge on the dealer's part and the salespeople's part. Then, of course, came the misinformation, which was a side effect of that. Chevrolet didn't know how to sell the Volt to its dealerships, and it didn't know how to sell it to customers. And a series of botched advertising campaigns meant that consumers were left completely confused. Some ads, for example, criticised pure electric models and played on the idea that customers needed to have a range extender on board to ensure they didn't run out of charge, or then spend hours recharging. Some tried to make a big thing about how different the Volt was to other cars, playing on the futuristic elements of the vehicle's drivetrain and design. And neither of these techniques went down well with consumers or with dealers. Consumers don't want different. They need to feel that whatever's being sold to them will make them better, sexier, wealthier, happier, or perhaps that their lives can't possibly be complete without buying the thing that's being sold to them. You only have to look at the fake Chevrolet Jolt experiment by Matt Teskey from 3 years ago to see this in practice. Matt took a pre-existing concept car from a few years prior, threw in some clever marketing, and people were clamoring for one, even though it didn't actually exist. People didn't care it was electric. They cared that it was desirable. And by the way, while I'm still at it, Matt's asking GM to make the Jolt, pitching that it should be made in the GM Lordstown facility that was one of the factories shut down as part of the same restructuring that saw the Volt cancelled. And nobody else has covered this bit yet. Matt even pitched an idea to Chevrolet for it to produce a show car sports version of the Bolt EV called the Bolt EVX. Building show cars to capture buyers' attention at auto shows isn't at all unusual in the internal combustion engine world. But in the EV world, it's practically unheard of. And that's a shame because people respond to show cars. Ultimately, it was advertising and a lack of education which killed the Volt. At no point did anyone make the Volt a desirable car. Sure, if you live in EV-friendly states, the Volt has plenty of following because it came with incentives that made it worthwhile. And dealerships in those areas did care more about the car than those elsewhere because generally they were better informed and knew more about the vehicles, so they could sell more. But dealers don't want to know about a car that will cost them more to sell and more to service because it impacted their bottom line. The same is sadly true of the Bolt EV. It's a car that Doug DeMuro once called the uncool electric car that you should give a closer look to. It's a car that many reviewers have praised, but it's also a car that you probably don't know about unless you're really into plug-in cars. Sure, GM says it's committed to an all-electric future, and I do believe it. But unless it can figure out how to sell electric cars, it's going to run into the same kind of problems it's already run into in the past. Dealer apathy due to a lack of knowledge, a lack of interest from consumers due to a lack of knowledge, and advertisers who haven't got a clue about the history of the EV industry trying to sell a product they don't understand because of a lack of knowledge. Essentially, unless GM makes drivetrains a non-issue, gets all of its dealers on board by educating, incentivizing, whatever that takes, and getting customers on board, it's going to be a struggle. And the same might be true of other automakers too. Well, that's it. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.